The courtroom was quiet, save for the shuffle of papers and the steady ticking of the old clock on the wall. Judge Ellen Hartley adjusted her glasses as the next case file landed on her bench. The docket was packed, and this one seemed like another routine traffic infraction. Late registration, unpaid parking tickets, and a failure to appear. "Name?" she asked without looking up. "Daniel Harris," came a calm, measured voice from the gallery. She glanced up briefly. A sharply dressed man in a tailored navy suit stepped forward. He looked composed, his briefcase in hand. Still, she felt a flicker of irritation. Another citizen too busy to show up to court on time, probably expecting leniency, she thought. "You've missed 2 previous hearings," she noted, a trace of impatience in her tone. "Any particular reason for that?" "Yes, Your Honor," Daniel said, stepping a little closer. "I notified the court each time through formal channels. I was out of state, involved in federal litigation." Judge Hartley narrowed her eyes. "You're saying that your job gives you an excuse not to respect this court's time?" "Not at all, Your Honor," he replied. "I was fulfilling responsibilities that were unavoidable. I filed the appropriate documentation." "I see no reason to delay further," she interrupted. "You'll pay the full fine. No reductions, no exceptions. And your license is temporarily suspended until payment is received." Daniel raised an eyebrow but remained calm. "Your Honor, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. I work for the United States Attorney's Office. I'm a federal prosecutor." For a moment the words hung in the air, untouched. Judge Hartley blinked, slightly thrown off. "You're with the U.S. Attorney's Office?" "Yes, ma'am." "Assistant U.S. Attorney, Eastern District," Daniel said, producing an ID badge from his briefcase and placing it gently on the clerk's table. "My prior absences were due to active federal cases, one involving interstate fraud, another tied to a national security brief." A murmur rippled through the room. The clerk glanced at the ID, then at the judge, clearly unsure what to do next. The judge leaned back slightly. Her demeanor shifted, not dramatically, but the edge in her voice softened. She reached for the ID and examined it more closely. "Everything checked out." "I wasn't aware of your position," she said after a pause. "Still, the court must treat all individuals equally, regardless of employment." "Absolutely," Daniel agreed, his tone respectful but firm. "That's why I appeared today as required. I wasn't asking for special treatment, only for acknowledgement of the notices I submitted." Judge Hartley felt a twinge of discomfort. Something about her earlier tone now seemed hastier than it should have been. She cleared her throat and glanced back down at the file. "Let me review the case notes again." The judge read through the digital case notes again, this time with more care. Sure enough, the notifications were there, 2 formal letters submitted in advance of the missed hearings, each stamped and logged by the court clerk. Somehow they had been overlooked in the rush of scheduling. She looked up, her expression more measured now. "It appears you did notify the court properly. That was not fully accounted for in the initial review." Daniel gave a slight nod. "I appreciate you taking a second look, Your Honor." Hartley hesitated, then exhaled slowly. "Mr. Harris, in the interest of fairness, I'm setting aside the license suspension. The fines can be reduced to the base penalty, and any late fees will be waived, since your absence was documented and justified." "Understood." "Thank you, Your Honor," Daniel replied. There was no trace of smugness in his voice, only professionalism. For the first time, Hartley regarded him not as a faceless name on a docket, but as a peer, someone who also carried the weight of legal authority, who operated in the same world of pressure and precision. She gave a small nod. "I trust your time is valuable. We'll get this wrapped up quickly." Daniel collected his documents and prepared to leave the stand. As he did, the judge added quietly, "Thank you for your service." He paused, gave a short, courteous smile. "Just doing my job." "Same as you." Court adjourned and the room began to empty. Daniel walked out calmly, but with the unmistakable energy of someone who had just been misread, and had politely set the record straight. Outside the courtroom, one of the junior attorneys who had observed the exchange caught up to him. "That was something," she said. "She didn't expect you to say what you did." Daniel shrugged lightly. "It happens. Sometimes people make quick assumptions. But the system still gives us space to correct them." "Did it bother you?" she asked. He paused for a moment, considering. "It's frustrating when people don't look closely before drawing conclusions. But I've learned that how you respond matters more than how you're received." She nodded slowly. "Still, you kept your cool. I've stood in front of federal judges, defense attorneys, grand juries. You learn to stay focused. This wasn't personal. It was just someone working from incomplete information. Back inside, Judge Hartley remained at the bench a few minutes longer than usual. She stared at the docket, thoughtful. She had dispensed thousands of rulings in her career, but today's interaction lingered in her mind. Not because of embarrassment, but because it reminded her of something essential. Titles and appearances could never capture the full measure of a person's story. And sometimes fairness meant slowing down, just enough to see the whole picture. That evening, Judge Hartley sat alone in her chambers, the courthouse now quiet. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the space where voices and footsteps had echoed all day. She had processed dozens of cases, each one bleeding into the next. But Daniel Harris stood out, not because of his job title, not because of how the exchange ended, but because of what it revealed. She leaned back in her chair, slowly flipping open her personal journal. She rarely wrote about specific cases, ethically she couldn't. But today wasn't about the case. It was about perception, posture, and the silent weight that first impressions could carry. She wrote, "Today reminded me that law is more than rules. It's the space between rules where we show who we are." Hartley had never considered herself quick to judge, but the truth was more complicated. A full docket, limited time, and endless paperwork often made nuance feel like a luxury. You saw a name, a charge, and a history, and sometimes you made a snap call. Efficient. Decisive. But this wasn't efficiency. It was erosion. Earlier that day she hadn't seen a fellow officer of the court, she had seen a file. It took the quiet professionalism of someone like Daniel Harris to make her stop and reconsider. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't challenge her authority. He didn't demand recognition. He simply held his ground with clarity and calm, and in doing so, reminded her what judicial temperament was meant to look like. Across town, Daniel sat in his apartment, typing out a quick summary report for the office. His court appearance wasn't officially relevant to any pending matter, but he wanted to document it, just in case. As he wrote, he reflected on how close the moment had come to going sideways. He'd seen it happen to others. One misstep, one misread, and the whole tone of a hearing could shift into something adversarial. But today it hadn't. He hadn't let it. He thought of his first year in law school when a professor told him, "Your job is not to win arguments. It's to carry the weight of truth without losing your footing." That phrase had stayed with him. He carried it today. As he closed his laptop, he glanced at a framed photo on his desk, his family standing outside his graduation ceremony, beaming with pride. Everything he did with their voices in his memory. The way they told him, "Always stay composed. Your work speaks louder than anything else." The next morning, Judge Hartley arrived at court early. Before the day's docket began, she asked the clerk to review the internal notification system, how notices were received, logged, and flagged. "Let's not assume," she said. "Let's check." It wasn't a grand gesture. It wouldn't be headline-worthy. But it was real. And it meant that the next person, the next file, the next unknown name, might get not just a ruling but full attention. Because sometimes the law needs more than authority. It needs awareness. 2 weeks later, the courtroom was once again bustling. Clerks moving paperwork, attorneys pacing in quiet thought, and defendants waiting for their names to be called. Judge Hartley presided as always, measured, firm, professional. But something had changed in her process, even if no one else could quite name it. She had begun reviewing every case with a small but deliberate pause. When a name came up on the docket, she read it twice. She scanned each file not just for charges but for context, details too easily dismissed when time was tight. To her clerks, she had added a quiet new instruction: check for correspondence. Confirm everything. No one questioned it. They saw that she was still decisive, but more deliberate. It was subtle, but meaningful. One afternoon, as the last case closed and the courtroom emptied, Hartley remained seated on the bench longer than usual. She noticed the quiet. She liked it. It gave her space to reflect. She thought again of Daniel Harris, not because he had demanded recognition but because he had not. In his restraint, he had given her the opportunity to rethink a pattern she hadn't noticed herself following. He didn't ask for justice for himself. He simply expected the system to work as it was designed. And that had made all the difference. She later described it to a colleague over coffee. It wasn't guilt. It was awareness. The kind that sneaks up on you when you're too confident that you're already fair. Across the city, Daniel was back in the courtroom too, but this time in his own capacity as a federal prosecutor. He was leading a case involving a public corruption ring, one that had taken months to build. His team respected him, not just for his legal skill but for his patience and integrity. When things got heated, Daniel never flinched. He reminded them, facts matter more than emotions. Presence matters more than pride. After one hearing, a junior prosecutor on his team approached him with a question. You ever get misread? She asked. He gave a short laugh. All the time. And how do you deal with it? Daniel smiled. I don't waste energy correcting people who don't want to understand. But if someone's willing to listen, I'll make sure I speak clearly. She nodded slowly, absorbing that. Later that evening, Daniel received an envelope in the mail with the court seal stamped on the back. He opened it without much thought, expecting routine paperwork. But inside was a handwritten note on official letterhead. Mr. Harris, I wanted to thank you for how you conducted yourself during your recent court appearance. You reminded me that even in routine proceedings, we are called to operate with clarity, fairness, and respect, not just toward the law but toward each other. I reviewed the internal process that led to the oversight and made several changes. Quiet ones, but the kind that matter over time. No need to reply. Just know your presence made a difference. Judge Ellen Hartley. Daniel read the note twice. He folded it neatly and placed it in the back of his legal pad folder. Not for show, not for memory, but as a quiet reminder that progress often happens in moments that no one else sees. 3 months had passed. Autumn had crept in quietly, casting golden light through the courthouse windows each morning. Judge Ellen Hartley had settled into a new rhythm, one not dictated by procedure alone, but by a renewed sense of mindfulness. Her decisions hadn't grown softer. She was still known for her exacting standards, her insistence on order and preparation. But now something else had taken root, a pause, an instinct to ask why before what. In chambers, her staff had noticed the shift. She spent more time reviewing context, requesting background details that once would have been deemed non-essential. She didn't speak about it directly, but her actions told the story. The courtroom was still hers, but she carried it differently, like a room shared, not owned. One of her clerks, a recent law school graduate, asked her one afternoon, "Have you always been this thorough?" Hartley looked up from her bench notes and smiled, not unkindly. "No," she said. "But I'm getting better at it." She thought of Daniel Harris often, not because he had made a scene but because he hadn't. His silence had echoed louder than any argument. And somehow, that had stayed with her more than years of advocacy and rhetoric. In a world that so often rewarded noise, his calm had disarmed her defenses and forced her to look inward. What stayed with her most wasn't the badge or the title, but the way he held his space, not defiantly, not arrogantly, but with assurance that didn't beg for recognition. That kind of presence was rare, and rarer still was someone who could carry it without needing to weaponize it. Meanwhile, in another courtroom miles away, Daniel Harris was wrapping up closing arguments in a white-collar criminal case. The defense had tried to paint his case as overly aggressive, an attempt to make a name for himself. But Daniel hadn't taken the bait. He'd stayed with the facts, laying them out methodically, free of ego. The jury had listened. More importantly, they had trusted him. After the verdict, a young intern at the U.S. Attorney's office approached him in the hallway. She looked nervous but curious. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure," Daniel said. "You always seem so composed. Like nothing rattles you. How do you do that?" Daniel smiled, then looked past her for a second, his thoughts drifting. "I wasn't always this way," he said. "But I've learned that how people treat you, whether they're respectful or not, says more about them than it does about you. What matters is how you respond. Whether you let it change your character or just your strategy." She nodded slowly, taking that in. "You've got to stay grounded," he continued. "If you don't, the system will pull you into a rhythm that's not yours. It'll tell you who you are before you've decided for yourself." That night, he walked home under amber streetlights, passing families returning from dinner, law students in heavy coats, the hum of the city softening as dusk settled. He thought of the note from Judge Hartley, still tucked inside a folder in his apartment. He hadn't replied as she'd asked, but he had carried it with him, in small ways. In the cases he handled, in how he mentored junior staff, in the way he chose to show up. Not louder. Just clearer. Back in her office, on an evening when the courthouse was once again still, Judge Hartley started drafting a speech for an upcoming judicial panel. It was about the role of perception in courtroom dynamics. Halfway through, she stopped typing and opened a new document, this one untitled, Private. She began. "Sometimes we think justice is loud, a verdict, a ruling, a moment of clarity. But I've come to believe justice is also quiet. It happens when we choose to look closer. When we challenge our reflexes. When we admit we got it wrong, not because we were careless but because we forgot to ask another question. A better one. She never signed it, never printed it. But she reread it the next morning before stepping into court. It reminded her that the law wasn't just made in legislatures or shaped by rulings, it was lived, person to person, in real time. Daniel would go on to try more cases, teach workshops for new prosecutors, and eventually guest lecture at law schools. Some would remember his legal wins. Some would recall his arguments. But others, those who sat quietly in rooms where he refused to be shaken, would remember something else. That stillness. That quiet insistence on dignity. That invisible line between pride and presence, which he never crossed. And somewhere in a courthouse on the other side of the city, a judge would continue reading names on her docket. But now, every name came with a moment of thought. A space, however brief, where the system paused, just long enough to remember that fairness begins not with authority, but with attention. It was a rainy Thursday when Daniel Harris returned to the courthouse where it had all unfolded. He wasn't on the docket. He wasn't scheduled to testify or present. He was simply there as part of a training seminar for early career public defenders, an annual session designed to promote cross-department collaboration between prosecutors and defense teams. An unusual event, but one Daniel always made time for. The event was held in a smaller courtroom upstairs, used mostly for pretrial hearings. The room wasn't packed, just a few rows of eager faces, mostly young, some wide-eyed, others already carrying the weariness that the legal system tends to imprint early. Daniel spoke plainly. Not about theory. About reality. He talked about presence. About restraint. About power, not the loud kind that comes with a badge or a bench, but the kind that sits inside a person who knows who they are even when they're misread. He didn't mention the judge. Or that day. Or the note. But someone in the room had heard the story anyway. After the session, a young public defender approached him, nervous but direct. "You were the one in that traffic hearing, right? With the judge who didn't realize who you were?" Daniel tilted his head slightly, neither confirming nor denying. "I only ask," she continued, "because someone told me that story. It made the rounds quietly. People talk. But it wasn't the mistake that stuck with me. It was how you handled it. I thought, if that had happened to me, I don't know if I'd have stayed that calm." Daniel smiled gently. "You would have," he said. "Or if you didn't, you'd learn to." She looked puzzled. "Why not call it out? Make it known?" "Because that wasn't the point," he said. "If someone's willing to correct their course, they deserve the space to do it without being publicly shamed." She was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "It changed how I show up," she admitted. Daniel gave a short, almost imperceptible smile. "That's the real win then." That same week, Judge Hartley had been asked to speak at a judicial roundtable. The subject: implicit assumptions in fast-paced courtrooms. She'd been hesitant at first, unsure whether she had something meaningful to add. But when she arrived, she surprised even herself. She spoke not with certainty but with honesty. "We talk about impartiality as though it's a static thing," she said. "But in reality it requires maintenance. Attention. The more confident you are in your neutrality, the more dangerous you become, because you stop checking yourself. I forgot to pause once. I forgot to ask the second question. That won't happen again." There was no applause. Just silence, the kind that follows when truth has landed in a room and everyone's still catching up to it. After the session, one of her peers approached her. "You've been on the bench for over 20 years. What made you change your approach now?" Hartley smiled. "A man stood in front of me, calm as still water, while I was looking past him. He didn't demand anything. But somehow that presence demanded everything." Daniel and Judge Hartley never saw each other again. There was no reunion. No second courtroom meeting. No long-winded apology or headline-worthy moment. But their unspoken exchange continued shaping the rooms they walked into. She judged more carefully. He advocated more patiently. Others watched and changed too, quietly then increasingly with intention. The ripple had become a tide. Because change, like justice, rarely begins with spectacle. It begins in the pause between assumption and understanding. In the gap between what we expect and what we're willing to learn. Months passed. Then a year. Cases continued. Dockets grew. Names changed. But the courtroom, like time itself, kept moving, efficient, unrelenting, and mostly indifferent. And yet, in one corner of this system, something had shifted permanently. Judge Ellen Hartley was now known not just for her rulings, but for something quieter, the care she gave to each person who entered her courtroom. Attorneys, defendants, even clerks began to speak of her with a mix of respect and something rarer, trust. Her decisions still came swiftly but never without weight. She had become the kind of judge who didn't just ask what happened but why, and how justice could restore, not just punish. Occasionally, when she taught at judicial workshops or mentored new magistrates, she would share a simple anecdote, not with names or specifics, but with a single sentence. A man once reminded me without saying it, that titles don't tell the whole story. And assumptions are expensive. That was all she'd say. It was enough. He didn't capitalize on the courtroom moment. He never gave an interview. He never tweeted about the misunderstanding or used it as a talking point. He just kept working. Quietly building cases with integrity. Mentoring interns with purpose. Showing up in rooms where he wasn't always expected to be the most knowledgeable or the most senior, but often ended up being the most centered. Years later, when he was nominated for a regional leadership role in the Department of Justice, his nomination letter included a single line that stood out above the rest. Mr. Harris is the rare kind of lawyer who strengthens the room by how he carries himself, never through force, always through clarity, always through presence. On a gray morning, Daniel visited a local law school to guest lecture. After the session, a young student approached him, a first-generation college graduate, nervous but inspired. "I want to go into public law," she said, "but I've heard people talk about how difficult it can be, especially when you don't come from the right background." Daniel looked at her and smiled, the way he always did when someone reminded him of himself years ago. He said, "Then be the person who proves them wrong. Not by fighting every battle, but by refusing to lower your standard. Let your steadiness be your voice. And when someone misreads you, let them find out who you are by how you respond, not how you react." She stood a little straighter after that. And he noticed. There would be no headlines about what happened that day in court. No viral clip. No dramatic confrontation. Just a moment that changed two people, and the rooms they touched. Because sometimes, the most powerful shifts happen not when someone yells for justice, but when they stand still and let their presence do the talking.